The river whispered her name, though Noah refused to turn her head. She kept walking along the narrow path, her boots crunching on the frost-covered leaves. Winter had come early this year, wrapping the forest in an uneasy silence. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break it, but the river didn't care. It called to her anyway, its voice soft and insistent, like the hum of a distant melody she couldn't quite place. Noah knew better than to answer it. The stories her grandmother used to tell, back when the fire was warm and the nights felt safe, came rushing back now. "The water remembers," she would say, her voice a mix of reverence and warning. "It knows what you've taken, it knows what you've lost, and it always comes for its due." A shape flickered in the corner of her eye, a flash of silver darting through the trees. Noah stopped, her breath visible in the cold air. She clutched the strap of her bag tighter, the weight of it a reminder of why she was here. The box inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, felt heavier than it should have. She had tried to leave it behind, to forget, but the river had made sure she couldn't. "Just keep walking," she muttered under her breath, though her voice sounded small against the vastness of the forest. Her legs felt like lead as she forced herself forward, her steps mechanical. She couldn't afford to look back. Looking back meant seeing it, and seeing it meant acknowledging it. The path grew narrower as the trees closed in, their branches skeletal against the pale gray sky. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly sweet, a scent that made her stomach churn. She knew this place, though she had only been here once before. The memory pressed against her mind, insistent, but she shoved it away. She didn't have time for memories. Not now. The river appeared suddenly, its surface dark and glassy, reflecting the sky like a polished mirror. Noah stopped at the edge, her chest tightening as she stared at it. The current was slow, almost lazy, but she knew better than to trust it. Beneath that calm surface was a pull strong enough to drag her under, to hold her there until she couldn't remember which way was up. She knelt, setting the bag down carefully at her side. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped the box, the cloth falling away to reveal wood worn smooth by time. The latch was simple, unassuming, but it burned cold against her skin when she touched it. She hesitated, her mind racing with the weight of what she was about to do. But the river whispered again, louder this time, and she knew she couldn't wait any longer. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing the object inside. A silver locket, its surface engraved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift in the light. Noah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, but she hated it all the same. The locket had belonged to her sister. She could still hear the laughter, the sound of it echoing through this very forest as they ran together, their hands sticky with blackberry juice. She could still see the sunlight catching in her sister's hair, turning it to gold. But that was before the fight, before the accident, before the river had taken her. Noah clenched her jaw, forcing the memories back down. This wasn't about grief. This was about balance. She had taken something that didn't belong to her, and now the river wanted it back. She stood, holding the locket tightly in her hand. The metal felt warm now, almost alive, as though it were fighting her. The water seemed closer than before, the edge of the river licking at her boots like a curious animal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to. Her sister? The river? Herself? The words felt hollow, but she said them anyway. Then, with a sharp breath, she hurled the locket into the water. The moment it touched the surface, the river changed. Its calm dissolved into chaos, the water churning and frothing as though it were alive. Noah stumbled back, her heart racing as the air around her grew colder. The whispers grew louder, no longer soft but urgent, overlapping voices that filled her ears until she wanted to scream. Then the river stilled. The silence that followed was absolute, so heavy that Noah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. She stared at the water, half expecting the locket to float back to the surface, but it was gone. Taken. A ripple moved across the river, slow and deliberate, and Noah froze. Something was rising from the water, its shape dark and shifting, like smoke trapped in glass. It had no face, but she could feel it watching her. its presence pressing against her mind like the weight of 1,000 memories. "You brought it back," the thing said, its voice a blend of rushing water and cracking ice. "But that does not undo what was done." Noah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't mean." "Intentions are meaningless," the thing interrupted, its tone cold. "The river does not care for excuses. It cares only for balance." She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there. But her legs refused to move. "What do you want from me?" she managed, her voice shaking. The thing tilted its head, a gesture almost human. "You carry the weight of a life that was not yours to take. The river has taken what it is owed, but you remain out of balance." Noah's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" The thing didn't answer. Instead, it extended an arm, or something like an arm, toward her. In its grasp was the locket, its surface now dull and tarnished. Noah stared at it, her chest tightening as she realized what it was asking of her. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "I can't." "You must," the thing said, its voice final. "The river remembers. And now, so must you." The locket flew toward her, its chain wrapping tightly around her wrist before she could react. The metal burned against her skin, and she cried out, but the pain was fleeting. Instead, a flood of images poured into her mind, memories that weren't hers but her sister's. She saw the world through her sister's eyes, felt her joy, her anger, her fear. And then she felt the moment it all ended, the cold rush of water, the desperate fight for air, and the darkness that followed. When the images stopped, Noah collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The locket was gone, and so was the thing from the river. The forest was quiet again, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Noah didn't know how long she sat there, the weight of the memories pressing down on her. The river had taken what it was owed, but it had given her something in return. Not a punishment, but a reminder. The water remembers. And now, so would she. The first time I saw the clock, it was in the shop window of a narrow alley I'd never noticed before. The alley had that strange, timeless quality, neither dirty nor clean, neither busy nor abandoned. The clock sat on a pedestal, its face gleaming like moonlight. Its hands were impossibly intricate, twisting and curling in ways that didn't make sense for timekeeping. Beneath the face, engraved in elegant script, were the words, "Trade your time wisely." I wasn't looking for a clock. Honestly, I hadn't been looking for anything. But the clock seemed to hum, a vibration I could feel in my bones as I stood outside the shop. Without fully deciding, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax. Clocks covered every surface, mantel clocks, pocket watches, grandfather clocks, but my gaze kept returning to the one in the window. Behind the counter, an old man polished a silver timepiece. His eyes, sharp and pale, flicked up to meet mine. "You have good taste," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "That one's special." "What does it do?" I asked, my words sounding strange in the stillness. "It trades," he replied, setting the silver watch down carefully. "Moments for moments." I laughed, uneasy. "Moments for what?" "Whatever you need," he said, leaning forward. "More time for yourself. Time to fix a mistake. Time for someone else." My chest tightened. It was absurd, but something about the clock felt possible. "How does it work?" I asked, my voice softer now. He gestured for me to pick it up. The moment my fingers touched the clock, I felt it, a tug, as if the clock were pulling something out of me. When I flipped it over, the back of the clock had changed. Words had appeared, etched into the metal, 1 hour for 1 wish. Pay the toll. The old man's gaze didn't waver. The clock takes time from your life. Minutes, hours, days, you decide. In return, it grants what you ask. But be warned, the time you give, you don't get back. I should have walked away. I should have laughed it off, left the alley, and forgotten the whole thing. But I didn't. "I'll take it," I said. The old man smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A wise choice," he murmured, wrapping the clock in soft black fabric before handing it to me. As I walked out of the shop, The bells of a dozen clocks chimed behind me. At home, I placed the clock on my desk and stared at it for hours. The words on its back glinted faintly in the lamplight. 1 hour for one wish. Pay the toll. What would I even wish for? The question gnawed at me, until finally, curiosity won. I placed my hand on the clock. The sensation was immediate, a warmth, a pull, and then the clock's hands began to move backward. I didn't know how much time it had taken, but I knew I had to speak. I wish, I said, my voice trembling, to see my grandmother again. She had died when I was 12, and I hadn't seen her since the last day I visited the hospital. My memories of her had faded, blurred by time and grief. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe nothing. But then the air around me shifted. The clock hummed, and there she was, sitting in the armchair by the window as though she'd never left. She looked just as I remembered, her gray hair neatly pinned back, her smile warm and a little sad. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft and steady. I couldn't speak. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled toward her, dropping to my knees by the chair. "Grandma," I whispered, reaching for her hand. It was warm, solid, real. For an hour, we talked. She asked about my life, about the things she'd missed. I told her everything, barely stopping for breath, desperate to fill her in on the years she'd been gone. When the hour ended, the hum of the clock grew louder. Her expression softened. "It's time for me to go," she said gently, leaning forward to kiss my forehead. "Be careful with that clock, my love. Time is a tricky thing." And then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lavender behind. I sat on the floor, clutching the clock, my heart pounding. It had worked. It had really worked. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed. The clock wasn't just a tool. It was a lifeline to the impossible. I used it sparingly at first, a day to undo a fight with a friend, an hour to relive a moment I cherished. Each time, the toll felt worth it. But the more I used it, the more I noticed the consequences. I started feeling tired, bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. My reflection in the mirror seemed older, the lines around my eyes deeper. And the clock changed, too. Its hands moved more erratically, and the words on its back shifted, "Beware the debt unpaid." The final straw came when I wished for more time with my mother. She'd been distant lately, wrapped up in her own worries, and I just wanted an afternoon where everything felt normal again. The clock granted it, but when the moment ended, she looked at me strangely. "What's wrong?" I asked. "You look different," she said, her voice hesitant. "Older." I laughed it off, but her words haunted me. That night, I placed the clock in a box and shoved it under my bed. I couldn't bear to use it again, but the clock wasn't done with me. Days later, I woke to find it ticking loudly on my desk, though I hadn't touched it. The words on its back were clearer than ever. The toll must be paid. I tried to return it to the shop, but the alley was gone, replaced by a brick wall. I tried to destroy it, but no matter what I did, the clock remained intact. Its ticking grew louder, a constant reminder of the time I'd borrowed and the debt I owed. Now, as I write this, the clock sits beside me, its hands spinning faster than they should. My reflection in the mirror is almost unrecognizable, my hair streaked with gray, my face lined with years I haven't lived. The clock has taken more than I ever intended to give, and I don't know how to stop it. If you ever find yourself in a strange alley, drawn to a gleaming clock in a dusty shop window, turn away. Whatever you think you need, it's not worth the cost. My office building didn't have a 13th floor, not officially, anyway. Like most superstitious skyscrapers, it skipped from 12 to 14, pretending the gap didn't exist. But that day, as I rode the elevator alone on my way to a meeting on 17, the buttons lit up wrong. A soft ding announced I'd arrived at a floor I couldn't believe was real. The doors slid open to reveal a hallway that seemed to stretch forever. It wasn't like the rest of the building, all sleek glass and steel. This was different. Old wood paneling, sconces casting warm light, and a faint smell of cinnamon. My first instinct was to press the close door button and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But curiosity won, as it usually does when I should know better. The air felt warmer as I stepped out, like the building was alive and holding its breath. The hallway was silent except for the soft hum of something I couldn't identify, like wind chimes, maybe, or whispers just out of earshot. The elevator doors closed behind me, but when I turned to look, they were gone. In their place was a blank wooden wall, seamless, as if the elevator had never existed. I told myself it was some sort of art installation. Maybe the building owners were getting creative with the architecture. But the more I walked, the less sense it made. The hallway wasn't endless after all. It curved, leading me to a single door at the end. It was painted a deep green, almost black, and etched with golden filigree that shimmered faintly in the sconce light. A brass plate above the handle read, Room 13. I should have left then. Every instinct told me to turn back, pound on the wall until the elevator reappeared, or just wait for someone else to stumble onto this impossible floor. But my hand was already on the doorknob, as if it had made the decision for me. The knob was cool to the touch, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. I turned it, and the door creaked open. Inside was not what I expected. It looked like a cozy library, the kind you'd see in an old movie. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books, a roaring fireplace, 2 armchairs facing each other with a small table between them. The air smelled like old paper and fresh rain, and the hum I'd heard in the hallway was louder now, a melody without words that felt strangely familiar. And sitting in one of the chairs was me. Not exactly me. Close, though, close enough to make my stomach drop. He looked older, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with years I hadn't yet lived. He wore a dark suit that fit like it had been tailored by someone who understood secrets, and he was smiling, in a way that wasn't comforting at all. "About time," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "I was starting to think you wouldn't show." I stared, unable to move. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. "Who, what?" "You, obviously," he said. "Or me, depending on your perspective. Sit down, we don't have much time." "Much time for what?" I demanded, finally finding my voice. "What the hell is going on?" He sighed, the kind of exasperated sigh I'd perfected over years of dealing with incompetent coworkers. "Look, I know this is weird. Believe me, I've been through it. But we don't have the luxury of a full existential crisis right now. Just sit down." Against my better judgment, I did. The chair was surprisingly comfortable, the kind that seemed to mold itself perfectly to my shape. Up close, I could see the lines on his face more clearly. They weren't just age. They were wear, like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. "You're going to have questions," he said. "I'll answer what I can. But first, I need you to make a decision." "What decision?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned forward, his smile fading. "You're at a crossroads. The kind most people don't even realize exists. Call it fate, call it destiny, call it whatever you want. But the choices you make today, here, in this room, are going to change everything." I laughed, sharp and nervous. "Yeah, sure. That makes perfect sense. I get on an elevator, end up on a floor that doesn't exist, meet my weird older doppelganger, and now I'm supposed to, what? Save the world?" His expression didn't change. "It's not about saving the world. It's about choosing which world you want to live in." The hum in the air grew louder, almost like it was responding to his words. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of confusion. "This is insane. This isn't real." "It's real," he said softly, "and you don't have much time." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 objects, placing them on the table between us. One was a small, silver key, intricate and old. The other was a coin, its surface blank except for a faint shimmer that seemed to shift when I looked at it. "The key opens a door," he said. "You won't know where it leads until you go through it. The coin, well, it's a gamble. Flip it, and you let the universe decide." "That's it?" I asked. "Those are my choices? A mystery door or a coin toss?" "That's all any of us ever get," he said, his voice tinged with something like regret. "You just don't usually see it this clearly." I stared at the objects, my heart pounding. What happens if I don't pick either? The hum in the air turned into a low, resonant thrum, like a warning. His gaze hardened. Not choosing is still a choice, but it won't be yours, and you won't like where it takes you. My mind raced. The key felt safer, more controlled. But what if the door it opened led to something worse? The coin terrified me, the idea of surrendering to chance. But wasn't life already a gamble? How do I know you're not lying? I asked. What if this is some kind of trick? You don't, he admitted. But I'm you, and I know how much you hate not having control. So maybe that's your answer. The hum reached a crescendo, vibrating through my chest. The room seemed to dim, the firelight flickering like it might go out. Time's up, he said. Choose. My hand hovered over the table. The key glinted in the firelight, solid and certain. The coin shimmered, its surface shifting like water. My chest tightened as I made my decision, my fingers closing around. The alarm on my phone blared, jerking me awake. I was back in the elevator, leaning against the wall, the buttons glowing in their usual order. Floor 17 dinged, and the doors opened to the familiar hum of office life. I stumbled out, my heart racing, my palms damp. But as I walked to my desk, I felt something in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out a small, silver key. What did I choose? And what happens now? I still don't know, but I think I'll find out soon enough. AITA for opening that door? Or for leaving it closed? The door at the end of the hall had always been locked, as far as I could remember. My mother said it was just an old closet, filled with forgotten junk from relatives long gone, and not worth the bother of sorting through. But she never gave me a key, and she never opened it, even when she thought no one was looking. That kind of secrecy invites a particular kind of curiosity, the kind that gnaws at you until it becomes impossible to ignore. I was 12 the first time I tried picking the lock. My tools were laughable, paper clips and nail files stolen from the kitchen drawer. The lock resisted me, of course, its stubborn click mocking my fumbling attempts. But something happened the moment I pressed my ear against the door, frustrated and defeated. I could have sworn I heard a faint hum, like a chorus of whispers just out of reach. After that, the door became an obsession. I'd sit in the hallway after school, my textbooks abandoned, and stare at its plain wooden face. I'd imagine the treasures hidden inside. Old letters, secret maps, maybe even a chest full of gold coins. Every once in a while, I'd hear the hum again, faint and fleeting, like a tease from another world. It wasn't until I turned 16 that I finally broke through. By then, I'd graduated from paperclips to an actual set of lock-picking tools ordered online under a pseudonym. My hands shook as I knelt in front of the door, the thin metal pick scraping against the pins inside the lock. The hum was louder now, almost a vibration, resonating through the wood and into my chest. And then it happened, a soft click, like the exhale of a breath held for too long. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. I expected the air to smell stale, like dust and rot, but it didn't. It smelled new, like freshly cut grass and rain-soaked earth. I hesitated, peering into the blackness, my heart thundering in my chest. "Mom," I called, half expecting her to appear behind me, scolding me for my audacity. But the house was silent, as it always was when she worked late. Steeling myself, I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my hands fumbling for the doorknob, but it was gone. The door itself was gone. I was no longer standing in the hallway of my childhood home. Instead, I was in a forest, its trees impossibly tall and ancient, their twisted branches weaving together like a cathedral ceiling above me. The air shimmered with a golden light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The hum was louder here, a melody that vibrated in my bones. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. The forest felt alive, like it was watching me, but not in a threatening way. It felt curious. I took a cautious step forward, the ground soft beneath my feet. The trees seemed to part as I walked, their branches shifting to create a path. I followed it, because what else could I do? The path led to a clearing, where a massive tree stood at its center, its trunk so wide it would take 20 people to encircle it. Its roots snaked across the ground like veins, pulsing faintly with the same golden light that filled the air. At the base of the tree sat a woman, her hair like silver threads cascading down her back. She looked up as I approached, her eyes shimmering like liquid mercury. "You finally came," she said, her voice soft but resonant, like a bell. "I've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "For you," she said simply. "You opened the door." I wanted to ask her what that meant, why the door existed in the first place, why it led here. But the questions tangled in my throat as she stood and held out her hand. "Come closer," she said. I hesitated, but something about her presence was magnetic, irresistible. I stepped forward, placing my hand in hers. Her skin was cool to the touch, but not unpleasantly so. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked, tilting her head as she studied my face. "Remember what? This isn't the first time you've been here." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What are you talking about?" "The door," she said, her silver eyes locking onto mine. "It doesn't lead to the same place for everyone. It leads where you need to go." "I don't need anything," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. She smiled faintly, as though she could see right through me. "Oh, but you do. That's why you've always been drawn to it." Before I could respond, she turned and placed her hand on the massive tree trunk. The golden light pulsed brighter, and a hollow opened in the wood, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. "Your path lies below," she said, stepping aside to let me pass. "What's down there?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Only what you've left behind," she said, cryptically, "and what you've yet to find." I didn't want to go, but the hum was louder now, a song that seemed to call my name. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hollow, the staircase creaking under my weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the golden light dimmed until it was replaced by a faint, silvery glow. At the bottom of the staircase was a door, identical to the one I'd opened in my hallway. My hand hovered over the knob, hesitation gripping me like a vice. But the hum pushed me forward, and I turned the knob. The door swung open, and I gasped. It was my room, but not as I'd left it. Everything was brighter, more vibrant, like a photograph with the saturation turned all the way up. And there, sitting on my bed, was me, a younger version of myself, maybe 10 or 11 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit I'd long since forgotten. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide with recognition and something else. Relief? "You found me," she said, her voice small but steady. "I didn't think you would." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I've been here," she said, "waiting for you to remember." "Remember what?" "That you left me behind," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "You forgot how to dream. You forgot how to believe." I stared at her, the truth of her words hitting me like a tidal wave. Somewhere along the way, I'd buried this part of myself, the part that saw magic in the world, that believed in impossible things. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean to." She smiled, and the room seemed to glow brighter. "It's okay. You found me. That's all that matters." The hum reached a crescendo, wrapping around us like a warm embrace. When I blinked, she was gone, and I was back in the hallway of my house, the door in front of me firmly shut. But the hum was still there, faint and comforting, a reminder that the magic hadn't left. I just needed to remember where to look. The room hummed with the sound of a clock that didn't exist. Samara felt it in her bones, a steady tick-tock that wasn't tethered to any hands or gears. The apartment around her looked normal enough. Bookshelves crammed with paperbacks, a couch sagging in the middle from years of loyalty, a faint trace of burnt popcorn lingering in the air. But the clock wasn't. It was an itch in the back of her mind, a sensation she couldn't shake, like the static hum of an old TV left on in another room. It had started 3 days ago when she found the watch. She'd almost missed it, sitting innocuously in the gutter near her building's front stoop, its face cracked but still ticking. She'd scooped it up on instinct, a relic from some stranger's life, and slipped it into her pocket without thinking. Later that night, as she examined it under her kitchen light, she noticed the engraving on the back, "For a time traveler, from a friend." At first, she laughed it off as some quirky novelty item, the kind of thing you'd find in a thrift store or buried in an estate sale box. But then the dreams started. Every night since, she dreamt of places she'd never been, people she didn't know, and conversations she couldn't remember. In one dream, she was standing on a beach beneath a sky filled with two suns, the sand warm but not hot, shifting with colors like a kaleidoscope. In another, she was sitting in a dimly lit bar where everyone spoke a language that felt like music, though she understood every word. Each dream ended the same way, with the sensation of falling backward into darkness, only to wake up gasping in her bed. Tonight, though, she wasn't dreaming. She was wide awake, staring at the watch as it ticked away on her coffee table. The hum of the phantom clock had grown louder, its rhythm syncing with her heartbeat. "What do you want from me?" she muttered, running a hand through her hair. The watch didn't answer, of course, but the air in the room seemed to shift. She felt it before she saw it, the faint ripple of something unseen passing through the space, like heat waves rising off asphalt. Then, without warning, the watch's hands began to spin wildly, faster and faster, until the ticking became a high-pitched whine. Samara reached out to grab it, but before her fingers touched the metal, the world blinked. One moment, she was in her apartment, surrounded by the mundane clutter of her life. The next, she was standing in the middle of a bustling marketplace, the air thick with the scent of spices and roasting meat. Stalls lined the cobblestone street, their awnings brightly colored and swaying in a warm breeze. People moved past her in a blur, their faces a mix of curiosity and purpose. "What the?" she started to say, but her voice was drowned out by a shout. "Newcomer," a voice boomed. "Over here." She turned to see a man waving at her from a stall piled high with mechanical oddities, gears, springs, wires, and gadgets that defied description. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and bright. "You're a traveler, aren't you?" he said, grinning. "First time." I don't know," Samara stammered. "Where am I?" The man's grin widened. "Where?" No, my dear. The question is when." Her stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" "This is a pocket," he said, gesturing broadly to the marketplace. "A little fold in the fabric of time. You must have stumbled in with that." He pointed to her hand, and she realized she was still holding the watch, its face glowing faintly. "I didn't stumble anywhere," she said. "I was in my apartment and then the watch brought you here," he finished, nodding sagely. "It does that. Quite the temperamental artifact, that one. Lucky it didn't drop you in a war zone. Or a black hole." Samara blinked at him. "Is this a joke? Am I hallucinating?" The man chuckled, digging through a pile of parts on his table. "Oh, you're not hallucinating. But you are in a bit of a pickle." He straightened, holding up a small, intricate device that looked like a compass crossed with a magnifying glass. "Here, take this. You're going to need it." "I don't even know who you are," she said, taking an involuntary step back. "Call me Anders," he said, thrusting the device into her hands. "And trust me, you'll want that. The watch is a finicky thing. It might send you back. It might send you forward. Or it might just leave you stranded here if it's feeling spiteful. That will help you get your bearings." Before she could argue, the watch in her other hand began to whir again. The hands spun faster, the glow intensifying. "Oh, here we go," Anders said, stepping back. "Hold on tight, traveler. And remember, the clock's always ticking." The world blinked again, and Samara felt the familiar sensation of falling backward. When she landed, it was on soft grass, the scent of earth and flowers filling her nose. She sat up, dazed, and looked around. She was in a vast meadow, the sky above her a deep indigo scattered with unfamiliar constellations. In the distance, she could see a city glowing faintly, its spires reaching toward the stars. She looked down at the device Anders had given her. Its face was spinning wildly, the needle jerking in all directions before finally settling on a single point. An arrow appeared on the glass, glowing faintly, pointing toward the city. "Fine," she muttered, pushing herself to her feet. "I'll play along." As she began to walk, the watch pulsed in her hand, its ticking steady and insistent. She had no idea where she was going or what she would find, but one thing was certain: the clock wasn't going to stop. When I first met my neighbor Rosa, she was planting tulips in the narrow strip of dirt that passed for a front yard in our apartment complex. She wore oversized gardening gloves and a floppy hat that made her look like a cartoon beekeeper. Her little dog, Max, sat nearby, supervising with the intensity of a foreman on a deadline. I liked her immediately. She had the kind of energy that drew people in, like a lighthouse in fog. Within weeks, we'd fallen into a rhythm of chatting over the fence that separated our balconies, borrowing sugar and milk, and swapping old books we never got around to finishing. So when Rosa knocked on my door one evening, cradling Max in her arms and looking unusually frazzled, I didn't hesitate to invite her in. She'd burned her dinner, she explained, and her kitchen smelled like a tire fire in hell. I laughed and offered her a plate of the spaghetti I just made. By the end of the night, she was laughing again, Max curled up at her feet, and I felt like I'd done something good. It wasn't until later that I noticed the strange tension she carried beneath her cheerful demeanor. It started small. Little comments about her apartment feeling weird at night or Max barking at shadows in the hallway. She joked about it at first, but the jokes grew less frequent. One night, she mentioned waking up to the sound of footsteps in her living room, only to find it empty. I tried to reassure her, suggesting it was just the building settling or someone upstairs being noisy. But the haunted look in her eyes stayed with me. A few weeks later, Rosa asked if I could help her rearrange her furniture. "The energy in there feels wrong," she said, her voice tight. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, but I didn't mock her either. If shoving her couch to the other side of the room would make her feel better, why not? We spent the evening dragging furniture around and hanging wind chimes she swore would clear the air. When we finished, her apartment looked almost exactly the same, but she seemed lighter. I chalked it up to the placebo effect and forgot about it, until the night I woke up to Max barking outside my door. It was 2 a.m., and the sound was frantic, desperate. I stumbled out of bed and opened the door to find Max sitting there, his tiny body trembling. He darted past me into my apartment, barking over his shoulder like he wanted me to follow. I glanced at Rosa's door, but it was closed. The hallway was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the building's ancient radiator. "Rosa?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. I grabbed a hoodie and followed Max down the hallway to her apartment. Her door wasn't locked, which wasn't like her. Inside, the place was dark, the only light coming from a flickering candle on the coffee table. The air smelled faintly of sage, and the furniture we'd rearranged stood exactly as we'd left it. But the room felt off, the kind of off that makes your skin crawl and your stomach knot. "Rosa?" I called again, stepping inside. Max bolted toward the bedroom, barking furiously. I hesitated, every horror movie I'd ever seen flashing through my mind. But the thought of Rosa alone and in trouble pushed me forward. The bedroom door was ajar, and I nudged it open with my foot. The first thing I saw was Rosa, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back to me. The second thing was the mirror. It was an old, ornate thing, the kind you'd expect to see in a dusty antique shop. It leaned against the wall, its surface reflecting the dim candlelight in eerie, distorted ripples. Rosa stared at it, unblinking, her hands resting limply in her lap. "Rosa, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. I stepped closer, my eyes darting between her and the mirror. As I reached out to touch her shoulder, she finally spoke, her voice low and monotone. "Don't. It's watching." I froze. "What's watching?" She didn't answer. Her reflection in the mirror didn't move. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand back. "Rosa, come on. Let's get out of here." She shook her head slowly. "It won't let me." I wanted to grab her and drag her out of that room, but something about the way she said it, flat, resigned, made my legs feel like lead. I glanced at the mirror again, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. Rosa's reflection wasn't exactly right. Her face was there, her body, but her eyes were staring straight at me, even though Rosa herself was still facing the mirror. "Rosa," I whispered, my voice barely audible. What's going on? Her reflection smiled. Rosa didn't. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Max barked furiously, but it sounded distant, muffled, like I was underwater. The room seemed to warp around me, the shadows stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Rosa blinked and turned to look at me, her eyes wide and confused. Ellie, what are you doing here? What am I doing here? I repeated, my voice cracking. What were you doing? She looked at the mirror, her expression turning to one of pure terror. No, 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 no. It wasn't supposed to happen again. What wasn't supposed to happen again? I demanded, grabbing her by the shoulders. Rosa, what is going on? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I thought I got rid of it. I burned the sage. I moved the furniture. I thought it was gone. What is it? I pressed, but she just sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I didn't sleep that night. Rosa stayed in my apartment, clutching Max like a lifeline, and I sat across from her, watching her every move. She wouldn't talk about the mirror, wouldn't explain what she'd meant, and when I offered to call someone, anyone, for help, she begged me not to. The next morning, she was gone. Her apartment was empty, the mirror nowhere to be found. There was no note, no explanation, just a hollow silence that felt heavier than it should have. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The landlord said she'd moved out overnight, no forwarding address. Sometimes I dream about that mirror, about Rosa's reflection smiling at me with those unblinking eyes. I don't know what I saw that night, or if I'll ever see her again, but every time I pass her old apartment, I feel it. Something watching, waiting. AITA? When I got the message from my cousin Kai, I was knee-deep in trying to fix my toaster. Not a particularly urgent task, but I decided that breakfast was symbolic of stability, and I couldn't let the toaster win. The message, delivered via video clip because Kai was allergic to normal communication, showed him standing in front of what looked like an abandoned carnival. His face, perpetually somewhere between charming and troublemaking, was lit by a flickering neon sign that read, Hollow Acres. Eve, he shouted into the camera, I need you. Big time. Life or death. Get here by Friday. Then the video cut off. I stared at the screen, trying to decide if this was a prank or the beginning of yet another of Kai's absurd adventures. The thing about Kai was that he could convince you to do anything, usually against your better judgment. When we were kids, he'd talk me into jumping off the roof of a shed into a pile of leaves. I broke my arm. He called it the best summer ever. I texted him back. What are you even talking about? His reply came instantly. No time to explain. Trust me. Bring snacks. I should have ignored it. I had work, bills, and a long overdue laundry pile. But something about the video, maybe the eerie glow of the carnival or the way his voice cracked on life or death, stirred an itch of curiosity. Against all reason, I packed an overnight bag and drove 3 hours to the middle of nowhere. When I arrived, the carnival looked worse than in the video. The rides were rusted, the booths empty, and the only sound was the faint whistle of wind through broken Ferris wheel spokes. Kai was waiting near the entrance, bouncing on the balls of his feet like a hyperactive kid. You made it, he said, throwing his arms wide as if I'd just crossed an epic finish line. This better be good, I said, stepping out of the car. What's so important that you drag me to the set of a horror movie? He grinned and gestured dramatically toward the carnival. We're bringing it back to life. I blinked. We're doing what? Hollow Acres, he said, his voice tinged with reverence. The greatest carnival ever. It's been shut down for years, but I bought it. Well, I'm renting it. Sort of. Anyway, I'm reviving it. You're reviving a dead carnival? I asked, my skepticism mounting. Not just a carnival, he corrected. A legend. Imagine it. Eve. Music, lights, rides, cotton candy. People need magic, and I'm giving it to them. And where do I fit into this fever dream? You're my logistics genius, he said, slinging an arm around my shoulder. I need your brain to figure out how to make this work. You're good with plans. Spreadsheets. Numbers. All the boring stuff I hate. I sighed, torn between exasperation and reluctant admiration. Kai's enthusiasm was magnetic, and despite my better judgment, part of me wanted to believe in his ridiculous vision. You know this is insane, right? Insane is just another word for unforgettable, he said, grinning. We spent the next 3 days assessing the carnival. The Ferris wheel was a lawsuit waiting to happen. The tilt-a-whirl was missing half its seats, and the funhouse mirrors had warped into grotesque parodies of reflections. But Kai's optimism was relentless. He called in favors, scrounged for supplies, and charmed every skeptical vendor he could find. By some miracle, people started showing up to help. Friends, strangers, even a guy who claimed to be a retired ringmaster. At night, we camped out in the rickety ticket booth, eating gas station snacks and debating the merits of funnel cakes versus fried Oreos. For the first time in years, I felt like a kid again, swept up in Kai's reckless energy. But cracks started to show. On the third day, the generator we'd borrowed broke down, plunging the carnival into darkness. One of the volunteers quit after a shouting match with Kai over safety protocols. And while Kai shrugged off each setback with his usual bravado, I could see the strain in his eyes. This isn't just about the carnival, is it? I asked him that night as we sat by a makeshift fire. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the fire, his face flickering with shadows. Do you remember the summer after Mom left? I nodded. How could I forget? Kai's mom had walked out without warning, leaving his dad to spiral into a mess of debts and bad decisions. That summer, Kai had built a miniature carnival in his backyard, a hodgepodge of cardboard rides and duct-taped decorations. It had been his way of coping, of pretending everything was fine. This place feels like that, he said quietly. Like, maybe if I can fix it, I can fix everything else. My chest tightened. Kai had always been the dreamer, the one who turned chaos into beauty, but I'd never realized how much of it was driven by pain. You don't have to carry all of this on your own, I said. We can figure it out together. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Thanks, Eve. But some things, you've just got to fix yourself. The next morning, I woke to find Kai already up, directing a group of volunteers with renewed energy. Against all odds, progress was being made. The Ferris wheel groaned to life, the lights flickered on, and a small crowd started to gather at the entrance. It wasn't perfect, but it was magic in its own scrappy way. As the sun set, the carnival buzzed with life. Children laughed, music played, and Kai beamed like a proud ringmaster. For a moment, it felt like everything really could be okay. But as I watched him, I couldn't shake the worry gnawing at me. Kai had poured everything into this dream, but dreams don't pay the bills or fix old wounds. When the carnival closed and the lights dimmed, what would be left for him? That night, as we packed up, Kai turned to me. Thanks for coming, Eve. I couldn't have done this without you. You'll always have me, I said, meaning it. But as I drove away the next morning, the carnival fading in my rearview mirror, I couldn't help wondering if I'd really helped, or just delayed the inevitable. AITA for leaving before the dream could crumble? Or was that the only way to protect it? The forest had no name, at least not one that anyone alive could remember. Maps called it unmarked woodland, and the few who ventured near it swore there was a heaviness in the air that made their compasses spin. Old stories passed from mouth to mouth whispered of a path that didn't stay in the same place, a trail that could lead you somewhere you didn't want to go and never bring you back. Most people avoided it, but for Asa, the forest was the only way out. He ran with his breath burning in his chest, his legs trembling with every step. Behind him, the sound of dogs cut through the night. The torches in the distance bobbed like fireflies, moving too fast for comfort. He clutched the satchel against his side, its contents heavier than it should have been for what he'd stolen. It wasn't gold or jewels. The value wasn't something you could see. It was something the governor would kill to get back, and if Asa didn't disappear tonight, he wouldn't live to see the next sunrise. The edge of the forest came like a wall of shadows. One moment, he was sprinting through open fields, the stars above him stretching forever. The next, the trees swallowed him whole. The world turned darker than black, and the sounds of the dogs faded as if muffled by the weight of the woods. He slowed, gasping for air, and tried to adjust his eyes to the absence of light. His heartbeat thundered, loud enough to drown out the silence. He didn't have a plan. He hadn't expected to get this far, to be alive long enough to make it to the forest. His whole life had been one step ahead of the next disaster, one bad choice spiraling into another, and now he was here with a satchel full of secrets he didn't understand, running into a forest that might as well have been the mouth of hell. Something moved ahead of him, a flicker of light, faint and soft, like a candle in the distance. His instinct told him to run the other way, but his feet carried him forward. There was no going back. He could hear the baying of the dogs again, fainter now but still there. He followed the light, weaving between trees that seemed to lean closer with every step. Their branches arched above him, creating a canopy so dense it felt like he was underground. The light grew brighter, shifting from a flicker to a steady glow. It wasn't a torch, nor was it anything natural. It had a bluish hue, cold and sharp, and it seemed to hum faintly as he approached. Ace's breath caught when he saw what it was. A door, freestanding, with no walls to hold it up, just a heavy oak frame and a surface that shimmered like liquid glass. The light came from the other side, bleeding through the cracks like moonlight. Asa hesitated. The dogs were closer now, their howls punctuated by the shouts of men. He had no time to think, no time to wonder what might happen if he stepped through a door that shouldn't exist. He grabbed the handle, its metal cold against his skin, and pushed it open. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence he'd grown up with, the uneasy quiet of a sleeping city, but something deeper, more complete. The air felt heavier, charged with something that wasn't quite electricity. The ground beneath his feet was soft, like moss, though he couldn't see much beyond the faint glow of the door behind him. He turned back to close it, but it was gone. The space around him wasn't like the forest. There were no trees here, no signs of life except for the faint, pulsing lights that floated in the air like embers. They moved slowly, swirling around him as if inspecting him. Asa reached out to touch one, but it darted away, faster than he could follow. He felt a strange pull in his chest, a sensation like being reeled in by something he couldn't see. The lights began to shift, coalescing into shapes that flickered in and out of existence. A figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't human, not exactly, though it wore the outline of one. Its body was made of the same glowing substance as the lights, shifting and rippling like liquid flame. Its face was featureless, but Asa could feel its attention on him, sharp and unwavering. The figure didn't speak, but its presence filled the space with a resonance that Asa felt in his bones. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The figure raised a hand, and the satchel Asa had clutched so tightly was pulled from him as if by an invisible force. It hovered in the air between them, the flap opening on its own to reveal the contents inside. A bundle of parchment, frayed at the edges, inked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as Asa looked at them. The figure tilted its head, or at least, it felt like it, and the air around them seemed to thrum with an unspoken question. "I don't know what it is," Asa said, his voice trembling. "I just know they'll kill me for it." The figure reached into the satchel, its hand passing through the parchment as though it were made of smoke. When it withdrew, the symbols on the pages had stopped moving. They were clear now, solid and legible, though Asa still couldn't understand them. The figure turned its attention back to him, and for the first time, Asa felt something resembling emotion emanating from it. It wasn't anger or fear, but something closer to curiosity. "You brought this to me," the figure said, though its voice wasn't a sound but a vibration in the air. "Do you know what it means?" Asa shook his head. "I told you I don't. It means you've chosen." The word struck him like a blow, though he didn't understand why. The lights around them began to swirl faster, their movements growing erratic. The figure reached out and touched his chest, and Asa felt a searing heat flood through him. Images flashed before his eyes, worlds he'd never seen, faces he didn't recognize, and a path that stretched endlessly into darkness. When the figure withdrew, the satchel fell to the ground, its contents untouched. The lights calmed, their movements slowing until they hovered around him like a protective barrier. The figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into smaller and smaller pieces until it was nothing but a cloud of glowing embers. "You've been marked," it said, its voice fading with the light. "The path is yours now." Asa stood alone in the silence, the satchel at his feet. When he looked up, he was back in the forest. The door was gone, the dogs silent, the torches extinguished. The forest stretched before him, endless and waiting. He picked up the satchel, its weight heavier than ever, and took his first step forward. The mailman delivered the box without a word. He just nodded, placed it on the porch, and disappeared down the street like nothing unusual had happened. But the box was unusual. For one, it was perfectly square, made of some kind of dark wood polished to a mirror-like sheen. There was no return address, no shipping label, not even my name, just a single embossed symbol on the lid, a circle with an arrow piercing through its center. It sat on the porch for a good hour while I debated whether to open it. I wasn't the kind of person who received mysterious packages. My life was painfully ordinary. Wake up, go to work, microwave dinner, repeat. But the box practically buzzed with intrigue. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I dragged it inside and grabbed a knife. The moment the blade touched the wood, the box shuddered, like a living thing. I jumped back, but the lid popped open on its own, releasing a faint, metallic scent into the air. Inside was a single object, a small, metal orb, smooth and featureless, except for a tiny hole at its base. I stared at it, waiting for something to happen. A message? Instructions? A hidden compartment? But nothing came. It just sat there, impossibly still, its surface catching the light in ways that made it look almost liquid. It wasn't until later that night, as I lay in bed with the orb on the nightstand, that it began to change. A soft hum filled the room, so quiet I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. The orb's surface rippled, and then it started to glow, a deep, otherworldly blue. I sat up, my heart racing. What the hell? I whispered to no one. The orb responded. A voice, smooth and layered like a dozen people speaking in harmony, echoed in my mind. "You have been chosen." "For what?" I asked aloud, feeling ridiculous for talking to an inanimate object. The orb pulsed. "To fix what is broken." I frowned. "I think you have the wrong person. I can't even fix my coffee machine." The orb didn't laugh, though I half expected it to. "Your world fractures. Pieces are slipping away. You will retrieve them." It made no sense, and yet something about the words stirred a memory. Or was it a feeling that I couldn't quite place? Before I could ask another question, the orb's glow intensified, flooding the room with light. When the light receded, I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I stood in the middle of a vast, empty plain under a sky that churned like a storm caught in slow motion. The ground beneath my feet was cracked, glowing faintly with veins of blue light that mirrored the orb's hue. And then I realized the orb wasn't in my hand anymore. It was floating ahead of me, bobbing gently like a balloon. "Follow," the voice commanded. With nothing else to do, I followed. The plain seemed endless, but as I walked, shapes began to emerge on the horizon. Broken structures, fragments of things I recognized. A clock tower, half a ship's hull, the shattered remains of a Ferris wheel. It was like walking through a junkyard of forgotten memories. "What is this place?" I asked. The orb's voice came again, resonant and unyielding. "The wasteland of what-ifs. Everything discarded, abandoned, or erased ends up here." Ahead, a figure appeared, standing among the ruins. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just any figure. It was me, or at least a version of me. They looked younger, wearing the suit I'd worn to my first job interview years ago. Their face was tight with anxiety, their eyes darting around like they expected the ground to swallow them whole. "What's going on?" I demanded, but the orb was silent. The younger version of me didn't notice my presence until I stepped closer. When they finally looked at me, their eyes widened in recognition and fear. "You shouldn't be here," they said, their voice trembling. "This is mine. You gave it up." "Gave what up?" They pointed to a shattered mirror leaning against a nearby pillar. Inside its jagged shards, I saw flashes of a life that wasn't mine. Or, rather, wasn't anymore. A career I'd abandoned. Relationships I'd let crumble. Dreams I'd convinced myself were out of reach. Each fragment showed a different version of me, living a different life. "This is all that's left," the younger me said, their voice cracking. "And now you're here to take it back?" "I didn't even know this existed," I said, trying to make sense of the surreal scene. "How can I take back something I don't remember losing?" The orb floated between us, its light pulsing steadily. "Decide," it said. "Reclaim or let go." The younger me stepped forward, their expression desperate. "You don't understand. If you take it back, you'll lose everything you have now. Is that what you want?" I looked at the shards again, at the lives I could have lived. There was a version of me laughing with friends I no longer spoke to, a version holding a child I'd never had, a version standing on a stage, bathed in applause. The weight of it all crushed me. Why does it have to be all or nothing? I asked the orb, my voice rising. Why can't I fix what I have now? The orb's glow dimmed, and for a moment, I thought it wouldn't answer. But then it spoke, its voice softer than before. "Every choice leaves a shadow. You cannot change the past, but you can choose what to carry forward." The younger me stepped back, their form flickering like an old film reel. "You're not ready," they said, their voice filled with sorrow. "I am," I insisted, though my hands were shaking. "I just don't want to live in fragments anymore." The orb pulsed one last time, its light enveloping everything. When it faded, I was back in my bedroom. The orb was gone, but the memories of that strange wasteland lingered. On my nightstand sat a single shard of the mirror, its surface reflecting not what was, but what could be. It started with a missing sock, not the kind you lose in the laundry and eventually find wedged between the dryer and the wall, but something more deliberate. It was Wednesday, and I distinctly remember placing a pair of bright yellow socks, unmissable, on the radiator to dry. By Thursday morning, one was gone. Not misplaced, not fallen behind the radiator, just gone. At first, I laughed it off. Socks disappear. It's one of those universal mysteries. But then the other sock went missing, and then my favorite coffee mug, and a single earring from a pair I hadn't worn in years. I lived alone, so the idea that someone else was moving my things wasn't just improbable. It was terrifying. I changed the locks, convinced myself I was imagining things, and went about my life. That worked until the night I saw the door open on its own. It wasn't dramatic. There was no slam, no gust of wind, no creaking hinges like in a horror movie. I was sitting on the couch, eating takeout and half watching some forgettable show, when the door to the bedroom opened as if it had been politely nudged. I froze, noodles halfway to my mouth, and stared. The room beyond was dark and still, the door swaying slightly as if daring me to look closer. I didn't move. The next day, I found the sock. It was under the bed, twisted into a knot around a small, silver key I didn't recognize. That was the first time I heard it. A faint laugh, high-pitched and breathy, like the kind of giggle you'd expect from a mischievous child. Except I didn't have children, and the sound wasn't coming from anywhere it should have been. I didn't sleep that night. The key sat on my bedside table, glinting faintly in the light of the street lamp outside, as if it knew more than I did. I thought about throwing it out, but every time I picked it up, my hands felt heavy, like the weight of the thing was pulling me into the floor. So I kept it. That's when the dreams started. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left me waking up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. In the dreams, I was always in a forest, dense, dark, and humming with life. There was a path that twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the trees. At the end of the path, there was a door. Not a house, not a structure, just a door, standing upright in the middle of a clearing. It looked old, the wood splintered and warped, but the lock was shiny and new. I'd wake up just as I reached for it, my fingers grazing the cool brass handle. The next morning, I found another key. This one was gold, tucked inside my coat pocket, though I hadn't worn that coat in months. It was heavier than the first, and when I held it, I could feel a faint vibration, like it was alive. That was also the day I noticed the trees. It was subtle at first. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a flicker of green where there shouldn't be. But by the time I got home from work, there was no denying it. There was a tree growing in my living room. It wasn't large, barely taller than a houseplant, but it was undeniably a tree, with gnarled roots curling into the floorboards and leaves that shimmered faintly, even in the dim light. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stood there, staring, because what else do you do when a tree spontaneously appears in your home? The laugh came again, louder this time, and I spun around, expecting to see someone, or something, behind me, but I was alone. Alone, except for the tree and the faint hum that now filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. The keys were on the floor. I don't remember dropping them, but there they were, lying in a perfect line leading to the base of the tree. My hands trembled as I picked them up, one by one. The vibration stronger now, almost singing. The hum grew louder, filling my chest, my head, until I could barely think. Without realizing it, I was walking toward the tree. The bark was smooth under my hand, almost warm, and as I leaned closer, I saw something. A knot in the wood, shaped almost like a keyhole. My breath caught. The keys buzzed in my hand, eager, insistent, and before I could second-guess myself, I slid the silver one into the knot. The hum stopped. Silence pressed down on me, thick and heavy, as if the world itself had been paused. And then the tree split open. It wasn't like breaking or cracking. It was more like the tree peeled itself apart, revealing something impossible. On the other side was the forest from my dreams, vast and endless. The air thick with the scent of moss and earth. The path was there, winding into the distance, and at the end of it, just visible through the trees, was the door. I should have turned back. I should have called someone, told them what I'd seen, or at least taken a moment to breathe. But something about that path pulled at me, whispering promises I couldn't ignore. So I stepped through. The tree closed behind me with a soft thud, sealing me in. The air was cool and damp, the ground soft under my feet. I followed the path, the silence broken only by the faint crunch of leaves with each step. The door loomed closer with every turn, until finally, I was standing before it. It was just like in my dreams. Weathered wood, shining lock. But now I could see the faint carvings etched into its surface. Symbols I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They told a story, my story, etched in lines and curves that felt like memories I'd forgotten. The golden key buzzed in my hand, and before I could stop myself, I slid it into the lock. The door swung open, and everything went white. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The tree was gone. The keys were gone. But the hum was still there, faint and constant. A reminder that the door wasn't a dream. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the laugh, high-pitched and breathy, waiting for the moment I'm ready to return. The day the birds stopped singing, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't a gradual thing, like when winter sets in and their calls become scarce. It happened overnight. One evening, the neighborhood trees were alive with chirps and whistles, and the next morning, there was nothing. Not a single sound. I live in a cul-de-sac where every house looks the same, down to the faux shutters and manicured lawns. People here notice when things are out of place, but nobody else seemed bothered by the silence. It gnawed at me. Birds don't just vanish. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard something. It wasn't a bird, but a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on glass. I froze, straining to locate the sound. It seemed to be coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone for light and tiptoed down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I swept the light across the room and saw it. A bird, perched on the outside of my sliding glass door, pecking at the glass with eerie precision. Its feathers were glossy black, its eyes dark and fixed on me. It stopped pecking as soon as the light hit it, tilting its head as if studying me. I don't know what possessed me, but I unlocked the door and slid it open an inch. The bird didn't move, just stared, waiting. "What do you want?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous. The bird didn't answer. Obviously, but it dropped something on the ground, something shiny that skittered across the tiles. Then it flew off into the night, leaving me alone with my pounding heart and the strange object at my feet. It was a key. Small, silver, and old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect to see in a Victorian mansion. It had a tag attached, a tiny rectangle of weathered paper with a single word written in neat, looping script, "Open." I should have thrown it away. Any sane person would have. But instead, I slipped it into my pocket and spent the rest of the night staring at it, wondering what it was meant to open. The next morning, the silence outside was even more oppressive. The neighborhood felt wrong, as if the absence of birds had drained all the life from it. That afternoon, I went for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I wasn't paying attention to where I was going, so it took me a moment to realize I'd wandered to the edge of the woods at the back of the neighborhood, a place I'd never explored. The trees were tall and dense, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. I hesitated, feeling a strange pull toward the shadows. I don't know why I went in. Curiosity, maybe. Or something deeper, something I couldn't explain. The air grew cooler as I walked, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. The silence here was absolute, so much so that my own footsteps felt intrusive. Then I saw it. A small, weathered shed, tucked between the trees like it had grown there. The shed was ancient, its wooden planks warped and covered in moss. It had a single door, and on that door was a rusted lock. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled the key from my pocket. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward with a creak. The inside was dark, but sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, casting thin beams of light onto the floor. At first, it seemed empty, just a dusty space filled with the smell of damp wood. Then I saw the staircase. It was narrow, spiraling down into the ground, disappearing into shadows. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying with it a faint, unidentifiable scent. Everything in me screamed to turn back, but I couldn't. Something was waiting down there. Something I had to see. I descended slowly, the old wooden steps groaning under my weight. The air grew colder, the smell stronger, earthy, metallic, and faintly sweet. The staircase ended in a small, circular room carved from stone. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on that pedestal was a glass jar. Inside the jar was a single black feather, suspended as if by an invisible thread. I approached it cautiously, the hair on my arms standing on end. There was a plaque on the pedestal, its inscription etched deep into the metal. Return? I didn't understand, but the feather seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. Against my better judgment, I reached out and touched the jar. The second my fingers made contact, the ground shook, and the jar shattered. The feather shot upward, disappearing into the darkness above. The silence that had enveloped the woods was broken by a deafening cacophony. It wasn't just birds. It was every sound imaginable, all at once, a chaotic symphony that pressed against my eardrums. I stumbled back, covering my ears, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in my own bed. The key was gone, the feather was gone, and the oppressive silence had returned. But now there was something else. A figure, just barely visible through the curtain at the edge of my window. It stood there, unmoving, watching. I haven't opened the curtain. I don't think I want to know what's out there. But every night since, I've heard the tapping. A rhythmic reminder that something is waiting for me to finish what I started. AITA for opening the door? For following the key? Or did I awaken something that was never meant to sleep? The wind rattled the shutters as I stared at the email on my laptop screen, the cursor blinking like it was daring me to reply. My Aunt Gloria had written, "We're counting on you to organize the reunion this year. You've always been so good at pulling everything together, and we'd be lost without you." No question, no room to say no. Just a statement that I was, once again, the family's unofficial event planner. A title I never asked for but somehow couldn't shake. I closed the laptop without replying and leaned back in my chair, staring at the crack in the ceiling that had been there since I moved in 6 years ago. Funny how you could get used to ignoring something broken. For as long as I could remember, I'd been the one people turned to when things needed fixing. When Uncle Fred's third marriage ended in disaster, I was the one who drove 2 hours to help him move his stuff out of the house. When my cousin Tammy had a meltdown during her wedding planning, I was the one who swooped in and color-coded her chaos into a flawless timeline. It wasn't just family either. My boss regularly dumped last-minute projects on me with a wink and a "you're the best, Lucy." Friends called me at 2 a.m. to vent about breakups, knowing I'd answer even if I had a 7 a.m. meeting. I was the fixer, the doer, the dependable one. But lately, being everyone's go-to felt less like a compliment and more like a burden. The next morning, I woke up to another email from Gloria. This one was shorter, sharper. "Lucy, I need an answer. The reunion is only 2 weeks away, and we have no venue, no catering, nothing. We're all relying on you." The words prickled under my skin. We're all relying on you. The same refrain I'd heard 100 times before. I closed my laptop again, resisting the urge to throw it across the room. Instead, I walked into the garage, where an old project sat gathering dust. A half-built wooden canoe I'd started 3 years ago and never finished. I ran my hand over the curved frame, feeling the smoothness of the sanded wood. Building this canoe had been my dream, something I'd planned to take out on quiet lakes, away from the noise of everyone else's demands. But every time I tried to work on it, something more urgent came up. Tammy's wedding, Fred's divorce, Mom's leaking roof. This time, I picked up the tools. By noon, I'd made more progress on the canoe than I had in years. Sawdust clung to my hair, and my muscles ached in a satisfying way. I ignored the buzzing of my phone in the corner of the garage, the steady stream of texts I knew were piling up. By evening, the texts turned into voicemails. I didn't listen to a single one. On the second day, I woke up to a call from my mom. I almost didn't answer, but guilt got the better of me. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Lucy," she began, her tone already exasperated. "Gloria says you're not answering her emails. What's going on? You're usually so responsible." "I've been busy," I said, running my fingers over a jagged edge of the canoe that still needed sanding. "Busy with what?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Don't tell me it's that canoe again. Gloria needs you." "I need me, Mom," I snapped, surprising even myself. I've been doing everything for everyone else for years. Just this once, I'm putting myself first. Mom sighed, the kind of long, disappointed sigh that only mothers can perfect. "That doesn't sound like you, Lucy. You're not a selfish person." "Maybe I need to be," I replied, hanging up before she could respond. The silence that followed was almost deafening, but it was also liberating. For the next 3 days, I worked on the canoe with single-minded focus, ignoring every call, email, and text. The guilt came in waves, but so did something else, relief. I wasn't running around fixing everyone else's problems. I wasn't being pulled in a dozen different directions. I was just here, doing something for myself. By the end of the week, the canoe was nearly finished. I stood back, admiring the smooth, gleaming wood, the sturdy frame, the way it seemed to whisper promises of quiet adventures on still waters. I felt a kind of pride I hadn't felt in years. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Gloria. "Lucy, this is really disappointing. The reunion is in chaos, and everyone's saying you don't care about the family anymore. I don't understand what's happened to you." I stared at the words, my stomach twisting. Did they really think I didn't care? All those years of showing up, of bending over backward to make everyone else's lives easier. Did none of that count because I said no this one time? The next morning, my brother Nate showed up at my house unannounced. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. "What's going on, Luce? Mom's worried about you, and Gloria's acting like you've betrayed the family. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, stepping aside to let him in. I needed a break." "A break?" he repeated, looking around at the sawdust-covered garage. His eyes landed on the canoe. "You've been hiding out in here?" "It's not hiding," I said, bristling. "It's doing something for me, for once." Nate sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I get it. But you know how Gloria gets. She's not going to let this go." "That's not my problem," I said, crossing my arms. I've spent years fixing everyone else's problems. Maybe it's time someone else stepped up. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. You're not wrong, he admitted. But good luck getting the rest of the family to see it that way. By the time the reunion rolled around, the guilt had dulled to a quiet hum in the background. I didn't attend. Instead, I loaded the finished canoe onto the roof of my car and drove to the nearest lake. The water was calm, the kind of glassy stillness that felt like an invitation. As I paddled out to the center, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, I thought about Gloria's words, about how the family thought I didn't care. They were wrong, of course. I cared deeply, but I was finally learning to care about myself, too. Back on shore, I checked my phone for the first time in days. There were a dozen new messages, some angry, some apologetic. I ignored most of them, but one from Nate caught my eye. How's the canoe? I smiled, typing back, it's perfect. Now, sitting here in the quiet, I can't help but wonder, did I go too far? Should I have stepped in to help? Or was this the right choice? Did I finally do something good for myself? Or did I just let my family down? AITA? When I first started working at Meadow & Company, a boutique marketing agency, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The office was stylish but cozy, stocked with beanbag chairs and an espresso machine that looked like it cost more than my car. Everyone was young, creative, and passionate about their work. And then there was Eliza, my manager. Eliza wasn't just the glue that held the team together. She was the glitter, the spark, the dazzling centerpiece of the whole operation. She had this energy about her, like she could bend time and space to her will. She wore bold red lipstick, spoke in short, sharp sentences that somehow always felt profound, and had a laugh so infectious it made everyone in the room feel like they were in on some big cosmic joke. I admired her immediately. From the start, Eliza took me under her wing. She'd call me kid, even though I was only 5 years younger than her, and always had these little pearls of wisdom. Creativity thrives under pressure, or people will always forgive a typo if the idea is genius enough. She was the kind of boss you'd see in a Netflix dramedy, quirky but brilliant, demanding but inspiring. At least, that's how it seemed at first. Eliza's brilliance came with a price. She didn't believe in work-life balance. We're not clock punchers, she'd say whenever someone mentioned leaving at 5 o'clock. We're artists. That meant late nights brainstorming in the office, last-minute projects dropped into our laps on Friday afternoons, and team-building, happy hours that went until midnight and weren't really optional. I wanted to impress her, so I leaned in. I stayed late, answered emails at 3 a.m., and always volunteered for extra assignments, even when I was already drowning. The praise came quick and often. You're my rock star, she'd say with a grin. I don't know what I'd do without you, kid. It felt amazing, until it didn't. The first rail crack appeared 6 months in, during the build-up to a major pitch. Eliza decided our original concept was too safe, and scrapped it a week before the presentation. We pulled 3 all-nighters in a row, fueled by stale coffee and desperation, and when we finally stood in front of the client, Eliza crushed it. She dazzled them with our work, telling stories, painting vivid pictures of our campaign's potential. She didn't mention me or the team once. After the meeting, she clapped me on the back and said, "You're a lifesaver, kid. Couldn't have done it without you." But something about it rang hollow. I was too exhausted to argue, so I just nodded and went home to collapse. The cycle repeated itself. Eliza would dream up some impossible challenge. I'd throw myself into it to prove my worth, and she'd take the spotlight while handing me a casual thanks. At first, I convinced myself that this was just how the industry worked, but as the months dragged on, my enthusiasm curdled into resentment. The final straw came during the company's annual gala, a big, glitzy affair where the whole team gathered to celebrate our successes. Eliza had been hyping it up for weeks, promising it would be the night of our lives. I bought a new dress, prepared my best networking smile, and even let myself feel a flicker of excitement. Midway through the night, Eliza pulled me aside, her signature red lipstick smudged from too many cocktails. "Kid," she slurred, "you're the best thing to happen to this company. You've got that spark, you know? But listen, I need a little favor." I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. She gestured toward a group of clients by the bar, all wearing sleek suits and expensive watches. These guys are a big deal. They love talking to fresh talent, people with, ideas. Go impress them for me, will you? I hesitated. Eliza, I thought this was supposed to be a celebration. I didn't come here to work. Her face darkened for a split second before snapping back into her usual grin. Oh, come on, kid. Don't be like that. This is your chance to shine, too. Get in there and show them what you're made of. For the team. For the team. Something inside me snapped. I thought about all the late nights, the missed weekends, the times I'd put her needs above my own. I thought about how every success was hers to flaunt, while every failure landed squarely on my shoulders. Eliza, I said, my voice shaking slightly, I think I'm done. She blinked, confused. Done? With what? With this, I said, gesturing vaguely at the room. With being your rock star. With bending over backward to make you look good. I'm done sacrificing my time and energy for someone who doesn't even see me. The words hung in the air like a slap. Eliza's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw something cold beneath her charming exterior. Wow, she said, her voice low and sharp. I didn't realize you were keeping a tally. I thought you wanted to succeed, but I guess I was wrong about you. I stared at her, stunned. I do want to succeed, I said. I just don't want to do it like this. Her smile returned, but it was razor thin now. Well, good luck with that, kid, she said before turning on her heel and walking away. I left the gala early, my head spinning. Part of me wondered if I'd made a huge mistake, if I'd just torched my career for the sake of my pride. But as I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. In the weeks that followed, I started setting boundaries. I stopped answering emails after hours, took my lunch breaks without guilt, and even said no to a few of Eliza's demands. The backlash was immediate. She gave me the cold shoulder, started passing my projects to other team members, and even hinted that I wasn't living up to my potential during a performance review. Eventually, I decided to leave the company. I found a new job with a manager who respected my time and talent, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. But every now and then, I think about Eliza, about the potential she saw in me, and the way she used it to fuel her own success. I wonder if I could have handled things differently, if I should have tried harder to make her see how much I'd given up for her. AITA? The stars had vanished. It happened overnight, with no explanation. One evening, the sky shimmered with constellations as it always had. By dawn, it was an infinite black canvas, featureless except for the dim glow of the moon. At first, astronomers assumed it was a natural phenomenon, an atmospheric quirk, perhaps, or some obscure cosmic event. But when telescopes revealed nothing beyond the planet's orbit, no galaxies, no nebulae, no familiar landmarks of the universe, humanity understood. The stars were not hiding. They were gone. Theo worked the night shift at the Obsidian Observatory, a facility perched on the edge of an isolated canyon. Once a beacon of discovery, it had become a place of resignation. Its massive telescopes turned aimlessly toward a void. Theo had taken the job more for the solitude than the science. His colleagues were gone, lured away by more practical pursuits in a world increasingly disinterested in the mysteries of the cosmos. Now, he was the observatory's sole caretaker, maintaining equipment designed to see what no longer existed. One night, as Theo stared at the blank sky through the observation dome, he noticed something strange on the monitor. At first, it looked like static, a faint flicker of light against the darkness. But as he adjusted the scope, the flicker sharpened into a pulse, rhythmic and deliberate, like a heartbeat. It came from the far edge of the void, impossibly distant, yet unmistakably alive. Theo's fingers danced over the controls, calibrating the signal and recording its patterns. It wasn't random. It was a sequence, repeating like an ancient code. The signal held him captive, whispering possibilities that sent shivers down his spine. What if the stars weren't destroyed but taken? What if someone, or something, was calling out from the place where they had been taken? Theo spent the following days consumed by the signal, deciphering fragments of its message. Words began to emerge, fragmented and cryptic. Remember, return, breach, align. He reported his findings to the global celestial network, but his messages went unanswered. Humanity, it seemed, had turned its back on the stars. Undeterred, Theo worked alone, piecing together the signal's meaning. He began to notice patterns in the code that mirrored constellations, shapes that had once adorned the heavens. But these were not the constellations he knew. They were older, wilder, filled with impossible angles and forgotten geometries. One night, the signal changed. The pulse quickened, its rhythm erratic, like a voice trembling with urgency. The final fragment of the message resolved: align the gate, breach the silence. Theo's heart raced as he realized what it meant. The observatory's telescope wasn't just for observing. It could also transmit. The signal wasn't calling to him. It was giving him instructions. He adjusted the coordinates, aligning the telescope with the source of the pulse. The moment the sequence locked into place, the observatory shuddered, its machinery groaning as if under immense pressure. And then, the sky split open. It wasn't light that spilled through the breach, but something far stranger. A cascading wave of color and motion that defied logic. Shapes that flickered in and out of existence. Forms too vast and intricate for the human mind to comprehend. Theo staggered back as the observatory filled with an otherworldly hum. He felt it in his bones, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through every atom of his being. From the breach, a figure emerged. It wasn't humanoid but carried an air of sentience, its body a shifting tapestry of starlight and shadow. It moved toward Theo without stepping, its presence both overwhelming and oddly comforting. When it spoke, it wasn't in words but impressions, concepts that flooded Theo's mind like the rush of a tidal wave. You are the witness, the keeper of the forgotten. The balance must be restored. Theo struggled to respond, his thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. The figure extended a hand, or what could be called a hand, and in its palm lay a shard of light, brilliant and pulsating. Instinctively, Theo reached for it, his fingers brushing the surface. The moment they connected, his mind expanded, his consciousness flung across the cosmos. He saw worlds that never were, civilizations that burned too brightly to last, and beings who had walked among the stars long before humanity's first breath. He saw the truth of the stars' disappearance. They had been taken by something older than creation itself, an entity that fed on light and life, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The breach was both a window and a trapdoor, a chance to reclaim what was lost, or to unleash something far worse. Theo awoke on the floor of the observatory, the shard of light still clutched in his hand. The breach was still open, the figure still waiting. He understood what needed to be done. The shard was a key, a fragment of the balance that had been broken. To restore it, he would have to journey through the breach, to the place where the stars were held captive. The figure's presence pressed against him, a gentle nudge. The path is treacherous, but you are not alone. Theo nodded, fear and determination warring within him. He stepped toward the breach, the shard of light glowing brighter with every step. The figure moved beside him, a silent guide. As he crossed the threshold, the observatory dissolved, replaced by a vast expanse of shimmering darkness. Ahead of him lay a labyrinth of light and shadow, its walls formed from the echoes of forgotten stars. The journey was unlike anything he could have imagined. The labyrinth shifted constantly, its paths folding and unfolding like the pages of a living book. The shard in Theo's hand pulsed in time with his heartbeat, guiding him through the maze. Along the way, he encountered fragments of memories, not his own, but those of the stars themselves. He saw their births, their deaths, their quiet songs to the universe. At the labyrinth's center, Theo found the entity. It was vast, its form impossible to define, its presence a weight that threatened to crush him. The shard in his hand flared, and the entity recoiled, its surface rippling like disturbed water. Theo stepped forward, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. "Return them," he said. "The light isn't yours to keep." The entity trembled, its edges dissolving. The shard in Theo's hand burned hotter, brighter, until it was a blazing sun. He hurled it toward the entity, and the labyrinth erupted in a cascade of light. The stars poured forth, each one singing as it returned to its rightful place in the heavens. When Theo opened his eyes, he was back in the observatory. The sky was alive again, the stars burning brighter than ever. But something had changed. He could feel their song now, their endless dance through the cosmos. And he knew he was no longer just an observer. He was their keeper. When Leona showed up at my door, it wasn't a surprise. Leona was never a surprise. She was the kind of person who made an entrance, her presence arriving 2 minutes before her physical body. This time, though, she was carrying a violin case, a taxidermied raccoon under one arm, and a look that screamed she'd just declared war on life itself. "I know what you're thinking," she said before I had the chance to think anything at all. "But hear me out. It's temporary." Leona was my half-sister, a walking hurricane of charisma and questionable decision-making. Our childhoods had been spent on opposite ends of the country. Me with Mom in a suburban bubble, her with Dad in a perpetual spiral of artistic freedom that mostly involved squatting in half-renovated buildings. We had grown closer in adulthood, bonded by our shared amusement at how spectacularly different we were. But this was new, even for her. I let her in because, well, what else do you do when family shows up holding a raccoon and looking like they've just been evicted from a circus? She plopped the taxidermy onto my coffee table and kicked off her boots, leaving a trail of muddy footprints that marched across my carefully vacuumed rug. "What's in the violin case?" I asked, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. "Not a violin," she said cryptically, then immediately changed the subject to how my apartment lacked soul. Over the next few days, Leona's presence in my space was like adding neon paint to a black and white photo. She claimed the couch as her own, draping it in scarves and thrifted tapestries that smelled faintly of mothballs and mystery. She filled my kitchen with jars of pickled things. It was unclear what they were, but she swore they were edible. And then there was the raccoon, which she called Algernon. Algernon wasn't just decor. He was her creative advisor. "I consult him," she explained one night as she adjusted the angle of his tiny bow tie. "He has a good eye for detail." I decided not to ask what kind of detail Algernon was allegedly good at. Instead, I focused on surviving the chaos. Leona was loud, opinionated, and completely indifferent to my rules. She invited a steady stream of people over: drummers, poets, a guy who sold neon signs out of his van, turning my living room into a kind of bohemian speakeasy. My neighbors started giving me looks in the elevator, the kind that said, "What the hell is happening in there?" Leona's excuse for staying was that she was finding herself, a process that apparently required borrowing my clothes, redecorating my balcony with wind chimes, and binge-watching documentaries about conspiracy theories. She claimed she was working on a project, but refused to explain what it was. All I knew was that it involved the violin case, which she kept locked and refused to let me touch. The turning point came on a Saturday night. I had plans to unwind with a book and a cup of tea, but when I got home, my apartment was unrecognizable. Leona had strung fairy lights across the ceiling, moved my dining table to the balcony, and turned my bathroom into a meditation nook, complete with incense and a small gong. The piece de resistance was the living room, where a crowd of people sat cross-legged on the floor, listening to Leona play a theremin. That's what had been in the violin case. A theremin. "Welcome," she exclaimed when she saw me, as if I were the guest in my own home. "We're exploring the soundscape of the human soul." I pulled her aside, trying to keep my voice steady. "Leona, you said this was temporary. You've been here for 3 weeks, and now my apartment looks like the inside of an Etsy shop exploded." Her expression shifted from giddy to offended. "I'm giving this place life. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you? For what?" "For turning my bathroom into a spa and inviting strangers into my home without asking." Leona crossed her arms, Algernon perched under one like a silent judge. "You've become so sterile. What happened to you? You used to be fun." I felt a wave of anger rise, but beneath it, a pang of guilt. Was I sterile? Had I let my love of order and quiet choke out the kind of vibrancy Leona embodied? For a moment, I questioned everything. Then I looked at Algernon, his glassy eyes staring blankly at nothing, and snapped back to reality. "This isn't about me being sterile," I said. "It's about you not respecting boundaries. You can't just move into my life and turn it into your art installation." Leona was quiet for a moment, then sighed dramatically. "Fine, I'll go, but you'll miss me when I'm gone. People always do." The next morning, she was gone, leaving behind a trail of scarves, a jar of something labeled pickled dreams, and a faint scent of incense that lingered for days. She'd also taken Algernon. For that, I was oddly grateful. Now, as I sit in my once again orderly apartment, I can't shake the lingering questions. Did I overreact? Was Leona right about me being too rigid, too closed off? Or was she just a tornado disguised as a sister, blowing through and leaving chaos in her wake? AITA,